As you can see, based on the first few activities I had you do, we're starting to get into something much less personal, right? The literacy narrative was very much about your own experiences, and we're still going to be talking about stories with the urban legend essay, but we're going to broaden ourselves outside of our own personal life, start seeing how things interact us as a society, as a group. Okay. Now, I want you to think about the quiz you just took, right? Those 5 outlandish stories, only one of which ended up being true. And I want you to think about why, if you were fooled, right? I know personally I did not know all those 5 when I first saw them. Think about why you were fooled, why you would think some of those are true when they're not, right? Now, the thing you got to think about with that is, even though those stories are very popular, right? By definition, urban legends are very prolific. Right? They're not passed on maliciously for the most part. A lot of times, the people telling them honestly believe them to be true. Okay, so when we think about truth, we have to think about it in a couple of ways, right? So, what is truth? Well, first of all, there is when you actually tell the truth, things that are actually factually true. Okay. So if you say the capital of the United States is Washington, D.C., that's a factual statement. Great. There's lies. Of course, this is when you purposely do not tell the truth, like the capital of the United States is Luxembourg. But sometimes, and this is where it starts to get tricky, this is where critical thinking is just so crucial to what you're doing here in English 101 and elsewhere in life. There are people telling false conceptions of the truth, things that they legitimately believe to be true, but that are not factually accurate. Okay, and this is really important when we're looking at urban legends, but also when you're looking at your research for an essay, when you're judging whether or not an author is presenting information that's correct. Okay. Now, for instance, there's a lot of times where people who you would think would know what they're talking about are presenting things that simply aren't true. We're all guilty of it from time to time. We think something is true, but it's not. Maybe we were taught wrong. Maybe we misremember something. But sometimes it's just an issue of not having full knowledge. For instance, a few hundred years ago, if you were sick, you went to a doctor, right? Doctors, height of their profession at the time, they would put leeches on you to suck out the bad blood. Yeah, there's no doctors who are going to do that now because we know now that that is a bad idea, right? But at the time, they thought that was sound medical science. Same thing, a few hundred years ago, people would say center of the universe is Earth. We now know it's the sun, of course. So that's something that they believed. You know, it's not like the people before Copernicus were lying to everyone. They legitimately thought the Earth was at the center of the universe. They were just wrong. And here's one, a little bit more recent. If you were to say, cut your arm right now, just a little nick, and blood came out, what color would it be? Red, right? Okay, that's an obvious one. But what about inside the veins or inside the arteries, right? If you could go in there without cutting anything, without letting any oxygen in, what color would the blood be? Did you say blue? Okay, then you're wrong. Okay, blood is actually still red even when it's in our veins and arteries. But a lot of people would say blue because we've heard a lot of people say, oh, well, before it's oxygenated, it's blue. It looks blue, right? Look at my veins. No, that's not true, right? It's just the warping of the light through our veins doesn't quite come out right. But it's actually red even inside, so sorry to burst your bubble on that one, right? Now, that's something that people think is true, right? Even when it's not. So a lot of times, like I said, this information that we present as true, but is actually false, is not done maliciously. It's just an issue of some lies or some false information sounds accurate. That's the whole point of this urban legend essay, to analyze why. Okay, so when we talk about this unit, there's a few terms I want us to define first. Okay, first is folklore, Folklore. Okay, and folklore are stories or information that's largely passed on through the oral or the verbal tradition. Okay, although it can include things that are written, like email forwards, Facebook posts, things like that. The big thing about folklore is that it's not what you find written in textbooks or in articles, newspapers, that are attributed to a certain author and then related to their name, passed on as their information. Like if I pick up The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, that's not folklore, right? But something like Blood Being Blue is folklore. That's a fact that people have passed on. It's not attributed to any one author, right? Similar with Little Red Riding Hood. We can find certain versions of that fairy tale that have been written down by individuals, but it's really part of the larger folklore, because if you look, There are hundreds of versions of Little Red Riding Hood from different cultures that have popped up over history, right? And if we start looking at different versions within certain cultures, we're talking about thousands of versions, right? If you're really interested, type in the story of grandmother to Google. Short read. It's an early version of Little Red Riding Hood that, yeah, it's pretty interesting. It involves her eating her grandmother's flesh. But I don't want to give you any more of a spoiler. If you want to look at it, the story of grandmother, great read. Okay? But so things like that are folklore, right? They're just passed on through oral tradition. People telling it, common people just passing it on. Now we have email, does the same idea. But part of that folklore is what we call an urban legend. Okay? And an urban legend can be defined as a contemporary, so a current, contemporary untrue story that many people have heard as true accounts of real life experiences. Okay? So just in other words, it's an untrue story that a lot of people have heard as true. It's presented as true. Okay? Now, the thing about legends, any kind of legend, urban or otherwise, is that they tell you a lot about the culture in which they come. Okay? Because a legend is a story that is passed on as true, whether or not it is, as part of folklore. Okay? And a lot of times they're embellished. They start from truth, but they go into things that are not true. For instance, think about George Washington. There's a lot of legends about him, right? Chopped down a cherry tree as a child. His father said, "Who did this?" And he said, "I cannot tell a lie. I chopped it down." Right? As my grandfather said, then he beat poor George, but that's a different part of the story, right? But the whole idea is, George Washington never told a lie. Okay. Now, I've heard people say legitimately that they believe George Washington never told a lie, literally. And that's possible. I can't imagine it's true, though, right? George Washington was a human being, politician, right? I doubt he went his whole life without ever telling a single lie. But think about why that story would be believed, right? Father of our country, perfect. The person who founded this country was without blemish. That's a great story if you want to have a very strong sense of country, right? But whether or not it's literally true is a different question altogether, right? Now, the same thing is true about urban legends, right? And what we're going to do in this essay is really analyze why a false story is believable, okay? Because it tells you a lot about the culture. Right? For instance, there's a legend called the kidney heist. You may have heard of it, where a guy is going to a bar, meets a young woman, they hit it off, buys her a few drinks, have a great time. She invites him back to her hotel room, and he's like, "Hey, great, right? Going to be a fun night." He passes out from the fun, wakes up in the morning in a bathtub full of ice, reaches down to the side, and feels a scar tissue there, and he doesn't know what's going on, and he looks over on the sink. There's a note, and he reads it and says, "Call 911 immediately. Your kidneys have been taken." Well, it turns out the woman was part of a organ trafficking unit who would lure people into rooms, steal their kidneys, put them on ice, and sell them on the black market. You've probably heard this story before, right? It's not true. There's never been any evidence of that being true. But you can start to analyze, what about it seems true, right? Well, you got to think about what parts are in this story. First of all, we have organ trafficking, right? Are organs sold on the black market? Yeah, they are, right? Not in this grotesque way, but there are people who sell organs. And sometimes there are people who sell humans, right? Human trafficking is a horrible situation where people are forcibly taken and sold into something like slavery, right? So you start taking these real world fears, these real world situations, and they start to blend into this really interesting story, right? With a little punchline, right? So it's taking real elements, but then coming up with a story that's just not true. But it sounds so good that people pass it on, right? And that's the core of what an urban legend is. Okay? So for now, what I want you to do is read the article called Urban Legends on D2L, and then I want you to finish the activities and the discussion questions, right? Start exploring some of these urban legends. And what we're going to do is move on from here and start diving into some actual urban legends that maybe you have heard before, maybe you haven't before. Then we're going to start analyzing one for our essay. Okay? So there's a lot of interesting stuff here. So stay tuned for more.